So glad to have Carl Trueman with us and his much better half, Katrina, from Scotland. So this is a mixed marriage and it's held together. So we're very glad to have both of them here. Carl Trueman is professor of biblical and religious studies at Grove City College in Grove City, Pennsylvania. Earned an MA in classics from the University of Cambridge, PhD in church history from the University of Aberdeen. He has written more than a dozen books. I do encourage you to also check out his podcast called The Mortification of Spin, good title, with Todd Pruitt, PCA pastor, also a friend. And also you can find his articles online, often writes for World Opinions, for First Things. He is an ordained pastor in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church and does many, many other things. And we are delighted to have you here. So let's welcome Carl as he comes to bring his first talk.
Thanks, Kevin. Well, it is a great pleasure to be with you this evening. I am indeed in a mixed marriage. I was actually born on Calcutta Cup Day. The English in the audience, the Scots will know the Calcutta Cup is the annual England versus Scotland rugby match. And on the day I was born, England beat Scotland. And my father's first words to my mother, apparently, when he came into the labour room, those were the good old days when husbands weren't allowed to be present in the birthing room, a practice of which I thoroughly approve, actually. My father's first words to my mother on seeing me were, "I hope you realize I had to miss the rugby to come in for this." So, I want to speak this evening on the Faustian self. I don't intend to recapitulate much of the material that I've laid out in my books on this subject. I want to expand and perhaps give a more broad-based picture of the rise of what I call the modern self by looking at things that I didn't examine so closely in those books. I made it very clear at the start of my project that I was not going to give an exhaustive account of the rise of modern personhood and modern selfhood. I was going to give a pretty narrowly focused account that should not be mistaken for a comprehensive explanation of why we are where we are. So tonight I want to add another thread or two to that tapestry. It is, and I've mentioned this countless times this year as I've given lectures, it is interesting that it is the 80th anniversary in 2023 of C.S. Lewis delivering the 3 lectures that were to become his great little book, The Abolition of Man. I had to reread it again earlier this year for a conference I was speaking at Calvin University, and I was struck at how the book seemed more true now even than it did when I first looked at it many, many years ago. Lewis's analysis of what's going on in the 1940s, he was writing at the height, of course, of the Second World War. Lewis's analysis of what was going on in the 1940s anticipates in so many ways the issues that face us today. And I think one could summarize those issues by saying that they cluster around a crisis in anthropology. So many of the questions that we face in our world today come down to questions of the doctrine of man. What does it mean to be a human being? Questions that swirl around identity politics. Questions that are being raised from another angle by the rise of artificial intelligence. Questions that are raised by social media as a primary means of forming social relationships. And of course, the very controversial question that has been perplexing some of the greatest minds over the last 4 or 5 years, and yet one which nobody, I think, would have thought twice about 20 years ago. What is a woman? I think all of them connect to a fundamental confusion over what it means to be human. The gender problem, if you like, of that last question is merely a function of a deeper anthropological confusion. And at the heart of this lies one of the things that I did try to address in my books, and that is that the modern myth of what it means to be human is this: man is born free and everywhere is in chains. And it is sort of arguable at the moment that we live Certainly in the latest and most extreme phase of that myth, perhaps we live at the very termination of that myth. Man is born free and everywhere is in chains. And I want to explore, why is it that we intuit ourselves as free, and that has become a real problem? First of all, though, I want to make a distinction that I think is an important one. The distinction is this, that for human beings, there is a big difference between what we are and who we are. There are many things that make human beings unique on the face of the planet, but I think one of them, and perhaps the most important one, is this. The what we are and the who we are separable, and one could go further and say the who we are is more important than the what we are. I don't know many of you at all, but I imagine if I wander up to you after the talk this evening and I ask you to tell me about yourself, you will probably tell me about the things that make you unique. You will tell me about decisions you've made or relationships you have that make you unique. Things that track back often to free decisions that you have made. That is not the same for other animals. To use a sort of thought experiment, I grew up in a very rural part of southwest of England. Yorkshire is, we call it, it's the north. We generally have disdain for northerners, as they have disdain for southerners like myself. So Jonathan and I, we too are from different ethnicities in some ways, in the English perspective. I grew up in a very rural southern upbringing, and there were lots of foxes and badgers in the area where I grew up. And a lot of farms, and for a while my parents kept ducks until one evening we forgot to bring them in and the fox ate them. The interesting thing is, if you've seen one fox in the presence of one duck, you've seen every fox in the presence of every duck. Why? Foxes are creatures of instinct. Foxes, I think, they're one of the most beautiful creatures on the face of the planet, and they are a perfectly designed, ruthless killing machine. You put a chicken in the presence of a fox, there is only one outcome. In fact, if the fox did not kill the chicken, one would have serious grounds for thinking that the fox was ill or not functioning correctly in some way. If you put a human being in the presence of a chicken, there is no way of predicting in advance how they're going to react. Maybe one would wring the chicken's neck, pluck it, and cook it for dinner. Maybe another one would take it home and make it a pet. Maybe another one would release it into the wild. Each of us would react freely towards that chicken. We are not just creatures of instinct. If I were to throw this microphone at somebody, your hands would instinctively go up to protect yourself. True, we have instincts. But the things that most shape who we are the free decisions that we make. We are a what? We are human beings. But the most important thing about us is our freedom. Why do I say that? Because we live in a time where, and this is where the Faustian side of this equation comes in, we live in a time where technology is supercharging our freedom in a way that is changing everything. You might say, well, I came here to have it explained to me why the sexual revolution took place or something like that. We're going to get to that. None of these big questions that touch us today can be explained in isolation from technology. And that's what I want to explore this evening. And I want to do it in this way because one of the temptations, I think, when dealing with something like the sexual revolution, which is where I want to head with this talk, particularly in Christian circles, is we can end up with a very, I thank you, Lord, that I'm not like other men kind of response. What I want to do this evening is suggest that we are all implicated in the anthropological problems of which the sexual revolution is merely one, albeit very powerful and very damaging symptom. But everybody is involved in the anthropological revolution that technology has brought about. Why do I call this lecture the Faustian Temptation? Well, I want to quote from the great German poet and playwright. In fact, he was great at everything, Goethe. He was a landscape gardener, he was a statesman, he was a politician, he was a genius. Nietzsche, when asked, what's the nearest thing to the Superman that you're looking for? Nietzsche would say, Goethe came closest, the man who transcended his day. I want to look at a brief passage from Goethe's great poetic play, Faust. You know the legend, Faust is the man who sells his soul, essentially, to the demon Mephistopheles. Well, early in Goethe's Faust, I think it's in the first or second meeting of Faust and Mephistopheles, Mephistopheles presents Faust with this temptation. And here I quote, "My dear sir, you are looking at things in a conventional way. We must do better than that, or the joys of life will escape us. Hang it! You have your hands and feet. You have a headpiece and a codpiece. And anything else you can enjoy is yours, isn't it?" And then we come to two very, very significant sentences. Mephistopheles' temptation sort of terminates here. He says, "If I can afford a coach and six, isn't their energy mine? I can ride around proudly as if I had 24 legs." Notice what Mephistopheles is presenting Faust with there. He's saying, Faust, you've got to think technologically. Yes, what is available that makes you powerful? If I, Mephistopheles says, have a coach and six, is it not as if I had 24 legs? I think what Mephistopheles points to here is the transformative power of technology. Technology reshapes how we think about what it means to be a human being. There's a temptation, I think, sometimes with technology to think it allows us to do the same stuff faster. That's not the case. Technology changes what we do. It changes our relationship to the environment. It changes how we understand ourselves. It tilts us towards seeing the world as raw material. It tilts us towards seeing ourselves as raw material. It tilts us towards seeing ourselves as something to be transcended. And in a dramatic way, to return to that who-what distinction, it allows us to believe that the what we are can be virtually eliminated in face of the who we might become through the deployment of technology. And that's the picture that grips the mind of our culture, and the picture that too often grips our minds too. And I want to look at some elements of this in order to bring out how it has changed the way we all think about ourselves. What I intend to do tomorrow morning for those who return for the Sunday school hour is to think about the human body. And what I'm going to do tomorrow is argue that the human body has a givenness and an integrity. It has a whatness. And that has to be where we start thinking about what it means to be a human being in human terms. Tonight, what I want to do is show how so many of the things in our culture have transformed our view of the body into something that's just raw material, of which, of course, the most radical example is transgenderism. But as I hope you will see, this is not a philosophy that just affects the most extreme fringes of our society. It dwells perhaps in the heart of all of us at this point. So I want to start, and the reason I've ordered my talk this way actually goes back to, I gave an earlier version of this talk at a college in, I think it was February this year. And before I went to the college, on the Tuesday night, I called the guy at the college who'd set up the talk. I was working out in the gym, and I suddenly had this feeling, am I going to be protested? So I emailed the guy, and I said, I'm not going to be protested, am I? Just this thought. He said, oh, no, our students aren't like that. You'll be fine. I arrived on the Wednesday night, and as I get into his car, he picks me up at the airport. He says, I need to bring you up to speed on something. And I was subject to what I think is probably, in the era of woke, probably the most polite protest ever. The students sat very quietly in my lecture. I knew who they were. They made it very clear who they were. They sat very quietly. I cracked a few jokes, and I noticed they laughed at them, and then they retreated to the protest area on campus to protest my presence. I had a spy sent over. It's quite funny. They were protesting me and a woman called Lila Rose, who's a big pro-life campaigner. Some of you may have heard of her. And I'm told that at the protest, they were reading out offensive things we had said. And Lila Rose is a big tweeter. So they were reading out these tweets. And the person who was spying for me said, the thing was, when it came to you, they had to read out whole paragraphs in order to show how offensive you were. So I was thinking, I can't be offensive in 130 characters or whatever. I've got to do a whole paragraph. But what I did was I rearranged the order of my talk in order to catch them off guard. But actually, on reflection, I decided that the order is the right order, because it catches us all off guard. And so I said in this lecture, I'm going to begin with the most important technological development in terms of the transformation of what it means to be a human, and the most offensive one. And they're all expecting me to say trans or something like that, transgender surgery. And I say music. Music. I want you to think about that. Let's think about music and how the way music has fundamentally changed the way we think about what it means to be a human being. What's interesting about music is this. Up until maybe 150 years ago, it had to be communal and it had to be live. I can't say every culture in the world has music. I am not familiar with every culture in the world. Every culture of which I'm familiar in the world, in world history, has a form of music. But prior to very recent times, that music had to be live. Why? Because music was communally significant. It was part of communal life. Music marked key and important events. Celebrations such as births, lamentations, funerals marked by music, or maybe defeats in war would be marked by music. Parties, those most human things where people just to get together to delight in each other's company, often marked by music. Communal experiences were shared and expressed in musical form. Think about the African American spiritual tradition, the suffering of a people expressed in poetry and music. I think there are some human experiences that cannot be captured just by prose. There has to be poetry and sometimes music involved. And they were communal songs because they caught the experience of a whole people. Think about the Psalms of the Old Testament. We could say a very similar thing about them. Communal songs, particularly the Psalms of exile. People suffering the same things, the same setbacks, expressing their solidarity with each other in words and music. Think of the rich traditions of ballads and folk songs that many cultures have. Think of the tradition of Appalachian music. I was never a country music person until I watched the Ken Burns documentary on country music a few years ago. A friend was saying, you need to watch. I said, 10 episodes of an hour and 3/4? I can't do that. I was hooked after the first episode because I realized that the roots of American country music are deeply embedded in the roots of a certain strand of the American people. Music arose out of, reflected, and was a constitutive part of communal life. And it was necessarily live. What did music do? Music reminded you that you were not an island. Music brought people together. It was a matter of communal production. If you wanted to enjoy music, you either had to make it yourself or you had to be among other people who were making it. It was a communal thing. Why do I say that? Well, think about music today. Think about music today. Music is, for most of us, most of the time, experienced as something for individual consumption. It was a communal production. Now it's a matter of individual consumption. Now, it would take too long to elaborate the full significance of that, but I would suggest to you there has to be a significance. When something that was there to draw people together and to remind them of their communal identity becomes something that actually drives people apart. My wife and I were sitting, we were on the plane last night, and we got upgraded, which was nice. Except by the end of the flight, I was wishing we hadn't been upgraded, because the two people in front of us had the most irritating, loud voices. And they talked for the entire time. And at the end of the flight, the guy on the other side of the aisle turned to me and rolled his eyes, and I just looked at him and said, I need a drink. I just need a drink. Katrina was said to me that she could see that the guy was nestling earbuds in his hand throughout the entire flight. And she was praying, will he not just put them in and cut himself off from this other person so we can all have some peace and quiet? But think about that. That's how we use music now, isn't it? We use music to isolate ourselves from other people. Music becomes something that isn't communal, it's private. Now, you might say, well, it's a bit of a stretch to bring that into LGBTQ, et cetera, stuff. And I say, well, but it isn't a stretch if you think it shapes how you think about what it means to be a human being. Are you a communal producer or an individual consumer? Is life lived according to your individual choices, or does it connect to some broader communal framework that involves obligations and dependencies, for example? I do a similar thing in my class at Grove. We talk about dance. And I put up on the screen a picture from, a still from the Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, the BBC version of maybe 25 years ago. The dance scene, Mr. Darcy dancing with Miss Bennet. And on the other screen, I put up a picture of John Travolta, Saturday Night Fever. To me, that's like a recent movie. To them, it's ancient. I was staggered. I was on a flight recently, and there's always that classic movie channel. So I click on the classic movie channel, only to find out the classic movies now include the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man franchise. I took my own kids to see that. You know, if it's not black and white, and it doesn't involve Gene Kelly or Fred Astaire, it's not a classic movie. I'm sorry. But the point of showing those two slides is this. Mr. Darcy makes no sense as an isolated individual. If you could somehow Photoshop out of that video sequence all the Miss Bennets and their various partners, and just look at Mr. Darcy dancing, he would look ridiculous. He finds his meaning as part of a communal group where there are obligations and dependencies of every member of that group towards every other one. We move into the 19th century, we develop the foxtrot and the waltz. And the group moves down to two. Still, there's a certain mutual dependency there. Then we move into the 60s and the 70s. And we see the emergence of disco dancing, for example. What is John Travolta doing? He's just strutting his stuff. It's self-expression for John Travolta. That's what's going on. It's a dance-off, and he's trying to win the girl. It's a mating ritual. And he's trying to let his inner self show through. Again, think about a culture where the communal has given way to the individual. That shapes how we think. And think about this. It's only possible because of technology. The rise of the free individual really accelerates when it is technologically enabled. And this is not an argument, it's an intuition. Music doesn't argue us into thinking of ourselves as individuals. It tilts us towards imagining ourselves as free individuals. Now, of course, we don't even have vinyl unless you're sort of a retro person. The concept album is dead. There can never be another Pink Floyd. Why not? Because we all put together our own playlists on Spotify. We choose what we listen to in the order we listen to it when we wish. And we use that music not to strengthen our ties with other people or to reflect our ties with other people, but to make ourselves isolated individuals. That which made me me and reminded me that I'm only me in connection with others, music, is now subject to my will as I consume it in isolation. So that's one aspect of technology, reinforcing that idea that man is born free and everywhere is in chains. Second, we can think about how technology has affected the medical field. Think about medicine. I would suggest that medicine has moved in the last 100 years from being conceptualized as primarily restorative to transformative. What do I mean by that? Well, a good example might be plastic surgery. Think about plastic surgery. We have examples of plastic surgery in the ancient world. It is not a new phenomenon, but it changes its sophistication in the 20th century. Really, plastic surgery, as I understand the history, takes off after World War I, particularly in Britain, where you have lots and lots of young men who've been horribly mutilated in the trenches, in trench warfare, returning home. And the vision was to try to restore some basic human dignity to them through that surgery. Think about how plastic surgery operates today. We now call it cosmetic surgery. And by and large, it is not restorative. It's transformative. Think about that, how that shapes how we think about the human body. When you have a restorative view of medicine, I would suggest at the back of your mind, you have to have a normative view of what it means to be a human being. Once you move to thinking of things in a transformative way, you start to think about the body more as raw material that can be reshaped according to your will. Dare I say it? The body itself starts to become kind of a link in that chain. You're born free, but your body holds you back. We see it in other areas, don't we? Gene editing. Don't get me wrong, again, I was talking to a very good friend, happens to be a PCA pastor, a few months ago, and gene editing came up, and this pastor friend has a granddaughter with a genetic syndrome. And he made the comment to me, if they could come up with a pill or a ray or something that would just fix that gene in my granddaughter, I'd say do it. And I remember thinking at the time, of course, because that would be restorative. We understand that this little girl has been born with something that shouldn't be there that is there, or should be there but isn't there. We have a normative understanding of what it means to be a human being. But that, of course, is not where gene editing will go in the long run. Gene editing will go in the direction of transforming what it means to be a human being. The realities of nature subjugated to human desire. And that then brings me to the sexual revolution. Again, you say, okay, we came along expecting to hear about LGBTQ stuff. Well, all of this thing, all of what I've said so far, provides the kind of background to that. The key, I think, to the sexual revolution of the 1960s is the default switch relative to sex is switched to recreation. If you've never read the work of the great Abigail Favale, she's a Catholic gender theorist at University of Notre Dame, writing some of the best stuff on gender around today. Abigail Favale makes the point that sex has always had a procreative and a recreational aspect to it. What she says is different about today is that the default switch was traditionally set to recreation, and now it's set Sorry, it was traditionally set to procreation. Now it's set to recreation. Think about that. First of all, let's think about how that is made possible. Well, for sex to be primarily recreational, it has to be safe, to use the modern terminology. You have to have ways of dealing with unwanted pregnancies or preventing pregnancies in the first place, and you have to have ways of dealing with those unpleasant diseases that can be picked up through unencumbered sexual activity. Technology makes that plausible. My wife and I were walking I think it was in Carlisle in Pennsylvania about 18 months ago, and we found ourselves walking through a pro-abortion protest. It was around about the time the Dobbs decision came down. My wife, being much godlier than me, is outraged by what's going on. I'm always thinking, is there something here I can use in a class to sort of illustrate a point? And sure enough, there was. There was a sign, one of the protesters, there were only about 6 of them, it was a rather pathetic protest, I thought. The protest of me was more impressive, to be honest, at the college I went to. One of the signs said, "Consent to sex is not consent to pregnancy." That's an interesting statement that would have made no sense 150 years ago. Only in a technological world like ours does that sign become plausible. Sex as recreation is only possible in a world where technology is available. But technology doesn't just cater to the imagination, it shapes the imagination as well. It's interesting, isn't it, that I'm reliably informed that when the pill becomes readily available in the 1960s, the numbers of abortions goes up. Isn't that strange? How do you explain that? Because the pill is meant to prevent all those pregnancies that were being aborted. Well, though I think the way you explain it is this. The pill further intensifies the idea that pregnancy is an unfortunate byproduct of sexual activity and not actually one of the obvious ends or products of sexual activity. Technology transforms the imagination. And once, of course, you have sex as recreation, you can then have sex as identity. Once sex is detached from its teleological functions, binding a man and woman together in a lifelong union, producing children, you're open to start thinking of sex as identity. Think about pornography. How does pornography change the attitude of people towards sex? Well, it intensifies the objectification of the other. We start to think of the other as a means rather than an end. Technology, of course, has turbocharged that. The statistics on pornography use are catastrophic and go down to pretty early ages now. Heard somebody just this week saying that by the time the average boy in America reaches the age of 18, he's probably seen more naked women than his grandfather would have seen in his entire life. Staggering. Staggering. Technologically enabled. But it also presents a particular vision of what it means to be a human being. A human being whose fulfillment comes from detached, isolated, individual sexual activity. It isolates something that is critical to being human from any kind of broader narrative. It changes the way we imagine that thing which brought two people together specially. Like music brought communities together, sex was to bring two people together in a lifelong union. Now we don't imagine it that way anymore. Just as an aside, I was very struck. This morning I was grading papers from the humanities class at Grove City, and I always allow the students in the humanities class, if you can write on whatever you want, as long as I can fit it under the broad rubric And the broad rubric is sort of anything that happened in the last 300 years. So it's pretty broad. I've been struck the last 2 or 3 years as to how many young women choose of their own accord to write upon the evils of internet pornography. Isn't that interesting? They are feeling dehumanized by that. Their understanding of how other people think of them is being fundamentally changed. They realize that there is a dehumanization going on here that cannot be isolated from technology. It is not that my generation were any more godly or sober than the present generation. But I was not going to be caught going to that creepy bookshop. I was not going to be spotted going into that sleazy cinema by my parents' neighbors, because they'd have snitched on me and then I'd have been in serious trouble. I was fortunate to grow up in a generation where there were social controls that curbed our most dark and sinful instincts. And that brings me then to transhumanism. What is transhumanism? One of the things that I think I missed in particularly my larger book on the self was this. I treated the T, transgenderism, as a function of the LGBT movement. And I think it is as a political phenomenon. I think as a cultural phenomenon, it is a subset of something else. It is a subset of transhumanism. And there are potent connections between leading transgender individuals and transhumanists. What is transhumanism? It's a term used broadly to cover a group of philosophies that see the transcendence of biological limitations as critical. The biological body must be attenuated. It is, if you like, the last barrier to self-creation. We see it manifesting itself in various ways. Interestingly enough, I think Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, they spot the technological problem that's emerging when they say that the more industry is automated, the less significant will be the difference between the sexes. They're really thinking in terms of economic production. You know, to make a horseshoe in the Middle Ages, you've got to be a big, burly, strong guy. Typically, blacksmiths, therefore, are going to be male. They're going to have certain testosterone levels in their blood. They're going to have gone through puberty in a certain way. Once you have a machine that makes horseshoes and you just press a button, there is no reason why the labor of making horseshoes should be divided in the way it typically has been. They see that technology will reconfigure the relationship between the biological sexes. I don't think they're anticipating transgenderism, but they're pointing to something that will lead to transgenderism. Transgenderism is based upon the idea that our bodily constitutions, the limitations of our bodily constitutions, can be overcome by technology. Lies at the heart of certain strands of feminism. Female body is regarded as a problem because it can get pregnant. And that's unfair. So we need technology to overcome that, to make the female body perform more like the male body. The latest iteration of this is transgenderism. We see it now with the advent of transition surgery, hormones, technologically enabled, and reshaping the social imagination. Think about 100 years ago. You go to the doctor and say, I think I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. The doctor's going to say that's a problem. It's a problem of the mind. We need to treat your mind to bring it in conformity with the body. Why does he say that? Because he cannot imagine saying anything else. Changing the body is not an option at that point. Now, we have hormone treatment. We have transition, or as they now call it, confirmation surgery. Isn't it interesting, that linguistic shift? Shaping the imagination. Gender confirmation surgery already buys you into agreeing with the basic premises. We can now imagine giving a different answer, and that's why if you go to the doctor today and say, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, he may be legally obliged to agree with your self-diagnosis and treat you in accordance with it. I had dinner with a pediatrician about 2 years ago, and I asked him, is it the case that if a young person comes in with gender dysphoria, that is the one medical condition that the patient has the legal right to self-diagnose on? And he confirmed that in his state that was the case. He said, I cannot contradict that diagnosis. Fascinating. Transhumanism lies behind all of this, the idea that the body can be overcome. Well, you might say, but we're not transhumanists, we don't buy into that. Well, I want to ask the question then, how important is the body in your human interactions? Another aspect of the world where transgenderism and transhumanism are plausible, I think, is a world where an awful lot of human interaction goes on in a disembodied form. Think about when I was at school. I've made this joke a number of times, but when I was at school, I had 5 or 6 friends, and if we fell out, we had a system of correcting the situation. It was called fighting, and we had individuals who would come on and correct the fighting situation. They were called teachers. They would come and they would literally smack both parties round the head, send them back to class, no counseling, nothing. We just got on with life. What was interesting was my intuitions were shaped by that. That I have a small group of friends and they are the only people whose opinion matters to me. Some anonymous twerp online has a go at me. It really doesn't have any effect. Well, it has a 30-second effect when I see it. But it has no long-lasting effect because somebody who isn't invested in me cannot touch me in that way. But that's because my friends are bodies. My friends are bodies. We have a rising generation of young people for whom most of their interactions are not bodily. They don't have the simple solution of punching each other to rectify the situation. Nor do they have a situation where having a pop at somebody is costly. I try when I write online these days, think, I'm not going to say anything in any article I wrote that A, isn't edited by somebody else, and B, I wouldn't be prepared to read out loud if that person was standing that far away from my nose. Insults have become very cheap in the world in which we live. Why? Disembodied human engagement. Technology has downplayed the importance of the body across the board, not just in terms of gender, but in terms of friendships as well. Here's a quotation from Mary Harrington. Great, she calls herself a reactionary feminist. Feminist who believes that women's bodies are important. If you haven't read her book, Feminism Against Progress, it's a great read. She starts off by saying, I ceased to be a radical feminist when my baby was born and I still considered her to be part of my own body. Interesting inversion of the sort of the feminist logic. Yes, the born baby's still part of my body, and that means I have an obligation towards it. She says this, when we socialize in disembodied ways online, even as biotech promises total mastery of the bodies we're trying to leave behind, these efforts to abolish sex dimorphism in the name of the human will end up abolishing what makes us human, men and women, leaving something profoundly post-human in its place. In this vision, our bodies cease to be interdependent, sexed and sentient, and are instead reassembled as a kind of meat Lego built of parts that can be reassembled at will. Maybe we're sitting here this evening and thinking, well, Trueman's talked about transgenderism and how much damage that's doing. I don't buy into transgender ideology. How do you do most of your socializing? How do you build your friendships? How do you live your life? Is embodiment important? One of the most amazing and shocking things to me during the COVID era, and this is not a comment on COVID policy one way or the other, but what shocked me most, I think, about COVID relative to Protestant churches was this, that when Protestant churches went online, so few people actually thought anything had been lost. It was tolerable for a long time to be online. Why? Could it be that we've lost the sense of the importance of the body for human identity and for human relationships, of which transgenderism is merely a symptom on one level and not a cause? I want to return to that tomorrow morning, but as I wrap up this evening, I want to suggest this. We need, as Christians, to think through a normative understanding of what it means to be human. What technology has done is it's tricked us into thinking that the what doesn't matter anymore. In fact, the what can be a mere function of the who, because technology delivers this power into our wills where we can be whoever we wish to be. The given whatness of ourselves no longer counts. What we need to do, I think, as Christians is this. We need to rethink the importance of the what and the implications that that brings in its wake. And that's what I want to do tomorrow, because I want to suggest that at the heart of what we are is the human body. And at the heart of what the human body is what Mary Harrington refers to as sex dimorphism, the difference between men and women. And it's only as we build our anthropology on that, and it's only as we make technology serve that rather than define that, that we can actually move towards a constructive Christian response to all of the chaos that is currently reshaping our society. Thank you very much for listening so patiently.